everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Marcia Eli from the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, which I will briefly mention has a full roster of programs this spring, including the People's Ball and our annual Night of Ideas, formerly Night of Philosophy, on May 21st. I hope that you'll explore these and other programs by going to the link in the chat. Tonight, we have the great honor of hosting Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, whose memoir, Lessons from the Edge, came out just weeks ago. You've probably surmised that the book was long finished by February 24th, the fateful day that Russia invaded Ukraine. So the timing of this memoir is uncanny and tragic, but I think also perhaps as it's a much needed balm of truth. It immerses us in a voice of experience and integrity and shares perspectives and experiences articulated in the thoughtful, unflappable, and decent style that we came to know from Ambassador Yovanovitch during the first impeachment trial of former President Trump. The book has received heartfelt and I would say grateful praise from reviewer after reviewer. The New York Times' Jennifer Zale writes, after reading one of the many dramatic moments, that I arrived at this moment in the book with my heart in my throat speaks to how skillfully Yovanovitch narrates her life story. David Ignatius of the Washington Post writes that Yovanovitch emerges from this narrative as a model of what America should want in its diplomats: courageous, steadfast, removed from politics to the point of naivete. Former Ambassador Yovanovitch could not have a more fitting conversation partner tonight than writer and journalist Keith Gessen, who himself was born in Moscow in 1975, coming to the United States with his family when he was 6 years old. Keith is co-founder of the literary magazine N+1, has written novels, edited nonfiction, translated Russian works, is a contributor to The New Yorker, among other periodicals, and was himself just in Ukraine, which I happen to know because he emailed from there. Before I hand this virtual stage over to them, I have a few very quick notes. First, we have or will put a link in the chat to a local bookstore, the community bookstore, so that you can explore Lessons from the Edge on your own. And if you so desire, purchase a copy from an independent business. Second, you have the option for closed captioning tonight. Click that live transcript at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I hope you'll share your questions this evening. Type them throughout the program into the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. And with that, it is my profound honor to welcome both of you to this virtual screen. Thank you so much for being here, and I hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Marcia, for that introduction. Thank you for having us, and thank you, Ambassador, for doing this event. So I definitely want to get to talk about the war. I think everybody wants to hear your thoughts about it. But first, I kind of wanted to talk about your book, which I've just read over the last week and really enjoyed and learned a lot from. So maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about your family background and your parents and how they came to the States.
My family were, both of my parents grew up in World War II in Europe. So my father had left the Soviet Union when he was just a small boy. They were allowed to leave. He grew up in Yugoslavia. He was taken prisoner of war in Yugoslavia, escaped the Nazis, made his way to France, and ultimately made his way to Canada. And my mom was a stateless person because she was half Russian, growing up in Nazi Germany, which was not a safe position to be in. She lived through the war in Germany and eventually via London, made her way to Canada, which is where my parents met. And ultimately, they moved to the United States, where my father got a good job teaching in bucolic, Kent, Connecticut. It's a teeny little town, not too far away from Brooklyn, actually, but very far away from Brooklyn in terms of the way it looks and the size. There were only about 2,000 people when we first moved there. And my parents were just so grateful that my father had a good job, that they could bring us up in security, that they were living in a country that celebrated freedom, where they could worship as they pleased, where they could meet with whoever they wanted to, because both of my parents, even though they had been young, lived in totalitarian regimes, and they understood what that meant and how fortunate we were to be in the United States. And they brought my brother and I up to be grateful for that and to want to give back. And so that was probably the biggest influence on my life, my parents, and my eventual decision to join the Foreign Service.
How did they feel when you started going back to these places that they had run away from?
Well, it's, of course, Germany was completely different. And when my mom finally went back, it was a united Germany, actually, after the fall of the wall. My father had always said he would never go back to the Soviet Union. And when I got an assignment to Moscow in 1993, I announced it to my parents, and I said to my mom, well, I hope you'll come. And I said to my father, I know you're never going to come. And he said, what? No, of course I'm going to come. And I have to say, because my parents were culturally Russian, even though they were both kind of a mix. But one of the greatest gifts I think I could give to my parents was spending, a lot of time with me in my assignments, both in Moscow and my 2 assignments in Ukraine, where they could really explore the culture and the history and the religion, which was an important part of their lives. And that was a wonderful way of giving them something back that was, precious.
Right. So you write in the book a fair amount about what it was like to join the Foreign Service back when you joined it. Quite a bit different, I hope, from what it's like now. And one of the things that interested me was you talk about the kind of a particular personality type that was prevalent in the Foreign Service. Like, how would you describe that person?
Kind of an introvert, and very logical, and the majority of Foreign Service officers are that type. I have to say, I kind of fell, a little bit, in the medium, or I could be half extrovert, half introvert, because I think all of us have elements of all of these characteristics. But I was definitely in the sort of the introverted, very rational way of doing things. And it felt to me like I had found my tribe. Here was a group of people that was interested in service and foreign service, the same kinds of things I was, foreign policy, history, politics, traveling around, and they approached the world in the same way that I did as well.
So you joined the Foreign Service, I'm blanking on the dates, it was the mid-'80s, right? Late 80s?
I joined the Foreign Service in 1986, sadly, right before you were born.
No, I was 11 years old. No, so yes. And you had it's just kind of amazing to read about all the places that you went to. So you were in Mogadishu, then London, then Moscow, Kiev, Bishkek, Yerevan, Kiev, and DC in there. So I don't know what was the most what was of those places, and we'll get to Kiev. Like what was the place that you would most that you found most fascinating?
Well, like no parent will tell you who their favorite child is. No ambassador is going to tell you what their favorite post is, because they're all, different and unique and precious in a different way. And I really felt that way about all of my posts, even though, my very first post was Mogadishu, Somalia, which was so remote and so difficult. I mean, I went from Manhattan to, Manhattan and driving around in taxi cabs and in the subway and stuff like that, to owning my first car. I mean, I got my driver's license in Manhattan in preparation for joining the Foreign Service, because all of a sudden it occurred to me, I might go someplace where there are no cabs. And sure enough, I went to Somalia where there were no cabs. And I had learned how to drive, and I bought myself a four-wheel drive Jeep. And that was a real learning experience. So, obviously there were other more serious challenges than that, but it was, everywhere you go, you learn something new, and you can take something from it that, helps you in the next place.
So let's talk about Ukraine. As you first encountered it, you had two postings in Kiev. The first one was this was sort of toward the end of Yushchenko, right? So,
It was before. It was 2001 to 2004, so right before the Orange Revolution. And number two there, and then I went back as ambassador from 2016 to 2019.
Right. So, so how did when you first encountered Ukraine in your first posting, it was really kind of struggling to, get out of Moscow's orbit. I mean, what was your kind of impression of it 20 years ago?
Well, so when I arrived in 2001, that was only 10 years after independence. And if you think about where the United States was 10 years after 1776, we were having a lot of challenges ourselves, including with, the former the former occupier, the Great Britain. So, I think sometimes we forget, and we're Americans, and we're so impatient, and we expect countries to chop, move it along because we provided some assistance and attention. And we provided a lot of assistance and a lot of attention, not just to Russia, but to Ukraine and to all of the countries of the former Soviet Union. So I arrived, as I said, 10 years after independence. And as you pointed out, I mean, there were challenges, no question about it. With President Kuchma was president at the time, and he was consolidating power and consolidating the economy. And so there were a lot of concerns about that. But I would say that much of our relationship was very much focused on the security aspects of the relationship. And at that time, at least to my knowledge, the US was not really focused on corruption as an issue that not only undermined the countries in the region and countries in other regions as well, but in fact, it could weaken our own foreign policy in the sense that, if you are seen by a population to be supporting a president or a leader who is corrupt, that undermines us a little bit in the eyes of that public. And but at that time, again, at least to my knowledge, we weren't really looking at corruption in quite that way. When I went back to Ukraine in 2016, it was definitely one of the pillars of our foreign policy. And that was in part because of the Ukrainian people, because they had it up to here with corruption in Ukraine, and had, this second revolution, the revolution of dignity, which means I want the rule of law. I want to be treated right by, the courts, the cops, and everybody in between. And I expect the president of the country to be under that same rule. And if he or she is stealing, then they should be held to account. And of course, the president at the time, Yanukovych, was not being held to account, nor were any of his cronies. And after Yanukovych turned his back on a closer association with the European Union under pressure from Putin, and it can only be said bribes, there were demonstrations in the streets, which ultimately led to his removal, or his removal from power, although he fled the country. I mean, he could have stayed, but he chose to flee the country with his $40 billion in ill-gotten gains. So I'm now forgetting why I got on that tangent, except to say that I think that there were challenges for Ukraine all along. I mean, as there are for all countries, but especially all new countries that are trying to create a new system. These were countries that were communist, that had a command economy, where nobody made an individual decision in any little city. It was all directed from Moscow. And there certainly wasn't a democracy or a civil society where people took initiative for themselves and a competitive political system either. And so all of these new countries, whether it was Russia, whether it was Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, they were all trying to build this new system, this new plane as they were flying it. And so inevitably there were a lot of challenges and some crashes along the way as well.
How, certainly in Kyrgyzstan, and then most certainly in Ukraine, to in a different way in Armenia, the role of Russia as, certainly always present, how corrosive was it? I mean, how much did you see sort of Russian influence and malign Russian influence on the development of those countries, and I guess Ukraine in particular?
Well, of course, it was different at different times over the last 30 years since independence. But I mean, here's the thing, the elites of all of these countries, I think pretty much all of them, I can't think of an exception right now. It's not like 1991 happened and all of a sudden there was a whole new set of young, innovative reformers that were in power. It was the same people for the most part. And those same people had grown up in the Soviet system. They had studied in Moscow. They were, they all knew each other. Many of them had been in the Politburo, which was kind of the ruling organization in the Soviet Union. And so it was, while many people said, many of these countries said that they wanted democracy and a market economy. And I think that many of the leaders were even sincere in that, but they had no idea what it meant. And so, they asked us for our help, and we tried to help them in these countries make that transition. And I think that our assistance bore fruit in a lot of places, and in other places it was perhaps less successful. But at the end of the day, I think we need to realize that, we tend to look at things through American eyes. That if something happened somewhere in the world, was it our fault, or was it because of something that we did? And now there's this whole debate about NATO enlargement and whether that set off Putin in some way, and it was all because of us. And we can discuss that particular issue separately. But I guess my view is that no question, the U.S. is a big and powerful country, and we can often put our finger on the scale and elicit outcomes and so forth. But the other thing is, Russia, Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, they are also actors in their own story. They have agency, and they are the most important ones. And if they really want to move forward with democracy and market economic reforms and so forth, they can make that happen, and they will make that happen. And, to use Ukraine as an example, Ukraine overwhelmingly voted for independence in 1991. And then in 2004, when reforms weren't happening, the people were not happy with what was going on. And there was an election, and the pro-Russian candidate, who Putin actually campaigned with, he basically fiddled the system and won the elections. And the people took to the streets. The courts ruled that the elections had not been fairly counted. And so there was a rerun, and the pro-Western candidate won. That was in 2004. And the people who had gone to the street, and this was a peaceful demonstration for months in a very, very cold winter. And they were like, great, you got it, you politicians, you're going to make these changes. But actually, that's not what happened, because some of the same old people were in power, and they weren't moving reforms forward, at least not fast enough for the Ukrainian people. And so fast forward to 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity, which was all about, a desire to move towards the West, a desire to end corruption in Ukraine. And I would even say that Zelensky's election in 2019 was, he was the protest candidate, the guy who wasn't the politician, the comedian. And people voted for him because he promised two things. He didn't have a complicated campaign platform. He said, I'll bring you peace in the East, in the Donbass area, and I will end corruption. We've had enough of that. And people took a chance on him. They voted him in 73%. I think the Ukrainian people have made it clear over and over again that they want change in their country and they're willing to struggle for it. And now I think in Ukraine, you see that they are willing to die for it. They do not want the Russian way of life. They do not want the Russian system. They do not want the Russians telling them what to do. They want to be a part of Europe.
Just to go back a little bit, I mean, what's your sense of what happened? It feels like in both after the Orange Revolution, 2004, and after the Maidan Revolution, 2014, the president who emerged from those, in Yushchenko after the Orange Revolution, Poroshenko after Maidan, kind of went through a similar cycle of a lot of promise and then kind of going back to the same old ways. How do you explain that?
Well, I think with Yushchenko, I mean, you may recall that he was poisoned during the campaign. I mean, really terrible. I mean, he almost died and his face was completely disfigured after that. This is, as I'm sure our audience knows, a favorite tactic of Russian assassins, although it has never been proved who poisoned him. So he was not a completely well man when he became president. I think that has something to do with it. But I think the other thing is that very quickly, the forces of darkness started pressuring him, and reforms just didn't move forward. With Poroshenko in 2014, I think he was in a very different position because this was already the second revolution. Ukraine was under incredible strain because Crimea was, by the time he was elected, not only had they gone through a revolution, not only was the government bankrupt because the former president and his cronies had taken pretty much every penny, but the Russians had grabbed Crimea, within a month it was theirs, and started a war in the Donbass. And so, he's this new president, there's no money, what do you do? And the reformers in Ukraine, both in his government and in civil society, when they talked with us, and I was not ambassador at the time, when they talked to the international community, they said, give us funds. And of course, Poroshenko was also asking for funds, but make sure that it is conditioned, that we don't just, hand over the money for various projects, that we ensure that they do what they say they're going to do. And this is all negotiated with the government, but between the alliance of reformers in government and in civil society and the international community, and the very clear will of the Ukrainian people that they wanted an end to be put to corruption, that they wanted people to be held accountable, that when they were driving down the street and not breaking the law, they didn't want the militia man to wave his baton at them and demand a bribe. They just wanted to live, kind of simply and securely and according to the rule of law. So, Poroshenko actually did make some significant reforms, and he and his team in the early years, but it's hard to maintain the pace because every time you make a change, you're breaking somebody's rice bowl. If you're, making more transparency in how you do government contracting, all those people that were making money on the side, which was a lot of people and a lot of important and powerful people, they get mad. And so it's just hard to do. I mean, it's hard to do in any country, setting the question of corruption aside. I mean, just think about the United States when we make reforms, for example, in the healthcare system. It is really, really tough. It takes almost a crisis to get it done. And there are still people, trying to undermine it and change it and everything else, whatever you think about that reform. The same thing is true in a country like Ukraine. It's just hard to get things done. Anytime you want to make change.
We have our own oligarchs here in the US. Somebody in the Q&A asks what your impression was of Yulia Timoshenko, and do you know what she's up to now?
Well, I actually just saw her about a month and a half ago, right before the war. She is still in politics in Ukraine. She is still a parliamentarian. She has her faction, and she is still very active. Like everybody else, she has rallied behind President Zelensky in this time of war. But she is, she's a smart woman. She is not ever to be counted out.
Um, Great. And so moving to your kind of ambassadorship, 2016 onward, how much the war in the East was ongoing.
Yes,
Um,
hot war in the middle of Europe.
and I guess two questions. I mean, how involved was the U.S. and you in sort of working with Ukrainians on Minsk implementation, and was that something that anybody was interested in, or not so much?
No, we were very, very interested in it. The Minsk agreements, the first one was in 2014, the second one was concluded in 2015, were negotiated among Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France. And there was a lot of pressure put on Poroshenko to sign because of the great loss of life, primarily military, but obviously people were concerned that about the loss of life, which is understandable. But the result was that Poroshenko signed these agreements literally at the barrel of a gun, because the Russians kept on fighting. And in fact, they kept on fighting even after they agreed, because they were constantly changing facts on the ground to better their position. And it was not an agreement that anybody really loved, but the Ukrainians at least made good efforts to implement their side of the bargain. The Russians did nothing. And I will tell you, the international community, and especially the United States, especially me, we worked very hard with the Ukrainians to ensure that they would, that they did their part of the bargain, so that the Russians couldn't accuse the Ukrainians of not doing so. We felt it was really important to keep up Ukrainian credibility to a document that they had signed. But and they did, passing laws multiple times, and the Russians did nothing. And at a certain point, it just becomes really hard for the Ukrainians to continue to want to do their part when the Russians were doing absolutely nothing except continuing the war on a very low, on a simmer in the East. Every week, 2 to 3 people died. Sometimes soldiers, sometimes civilians. And now, of course, we are witnessing the beginning of a really, really critical land war in that area again.
So you mentioned security cooperation earlier. So how was that? What did that look like? There's kind of there was a big debate in DC about the javelins, and first the Obama administration decided not to send them. Then the Trump administration actually did, with some interruptions, as we know. But what else was happening aside from that? I mean, the Ukrainian army that we see right now, where did that come from?
Well, the Ukrainians always had a very large army, and we've been working with them on, not just them, but other countries in the former Soviet Union, certainly in Eastern Europe and in other places around the world, on reforming their military, because it was too big, and it was, bloated, and they were spending the money, in our opinion, on the wrong things. But we work with them, and when I sort of glibly state all these things, it's not like we get to tell them what to do. I mean, these are discussions that we have, and we share our point of view about how we reformed our own military following the Vietnam War. And that in order for the Ukrainian military to be ready to fight a war, and if they wanted to work with us on military, whether it's military exercises or actually, work in Afghanistan with us, work in Iraq, and they did provide troops for both, having some element, some level of compatibility. So over the years, we had what we call a train and equip program, and we also, so obviously training Ukrainian soldiers, but also equipping them with various types of, back in the day, it was non-lethal equipment. And we also worked with them on things like doctrine and strategy and how do you reform a big military, and should you continue to have a draft, or do you want a completely professional military? And then there's the critical issue of NCOs, and that is the backbone of the U.S. military, where you have really seasoned NCOs going into battle with newer recruits or professional soldiers. And that is part of the reason we have such an effective military. You look at the Russian military, they don't have NCOs. That's why they've lost, I think the count is now at 8 generals, because there's nobody leading the troops in the front, and the troops don't know what to do. So you have generals going to the front and getting shot. So it's, so we helped them with all of those things. And then of course, in 2014, that went on steroids because they had this big war. And I would also say in 2014, the Ukrainian military, as always happens in a crisis, all of a sudden you're much more focused on what is it I really need to do? What do I really need to do to win this war? And we continued training them. We continued equipping them, providing them with a lot more stuff. There was, as you noted, the big discussion in the Obama administration about javelins. It was decided that that was escalatory or could be provocative in the eyes of Putin, even though I think many people in the administration and outside felt that the person who was being provocative was Putin by invading Ukraine and seizing Crimea. But that was a decision that President Obama made, and obviously was respected. When the Trump administration came in, after much persuasion, President Trump did sign off at the end of 2017, his first year in office, on providing javelins, the first set of javelins to Ukraine, and they were delivered in 2018. The second set of javelins was under discussion in 2019 and had been approved by our Congress. And then, of course, there was the fateful perfect phone call with the new President Zelensky, which, where President Trump basically used his office to put pressure on a foreign leader that was completely dependent on us in the sense of asking for military assistance in order to get a personal or political favor. So it was, when the transcript of that phone call was released in September of 2019, I think that was pretty shocking certainly for me. I was long gone from Ukraine by that time, but it was shocking to me that a president of the United States would be trading on his office like that. And of course, undermine our foreign policy because, dictators around the world could see, oh, I can make a deal with this guy. And so could bad actors in the United States in the private sector or someplace else, that this was all about making deals that would benefit Trump. It wasn't about our foreign policy and keeping America secure.
Yes, and of course, the reason you left Ukraine was you had been subject to this smear campaign orchestrated, it seems, by people associated with, well, clearly orchestrated by people associated with Trump and corrupt Ukrainian officials and oligarchs. You actually were mentioned in that phone call, in that perfect phone call, and Zelensky, as you say in the book, he kind of played along, but you've forgiven him for that?
I have. I mean, I think that Zelensky, like so many other people, foreign leaders, and dare we say American officials, played along with Trump, flattered him, told him what he wanted to hear. Not unusual. And here's a young and untried president who is, I don't want to say desperate, but who is very intent on getting the president of the United States to sign off on those javelins because he knows what it means for the defense of Ukraine.
How at that point, how conscious would you say that the sort of Zelensky and before him Poroshenko were of a potential wider conflict with Russia? There's this, I don't know if you saw this, one of his advisors, Arestovich, Alexander Arestovich had there's a video circulating of him, I think back in 2019 or 2020, talking about, there's going to be a big war with Russia. Basically, the price of our joining NATO is going to be a major Russian invasion. So did you sense that when you were there, that they thought that this was a real possibility?
Well, I knew Zelensky and I met him a number of times before he was a candidate for president. And then once he was candidate for president, but he was elected with 73% of the vote. I mean, the Ukrainian people really were all in on Zelensky. And then several days later, I was pulled out of the country. So I never actually worked with him as president. But even in the times that I met with him as a candidate, I did not get the sense that he thought there was going to be a wider war with Russia. I thought he got the sense he gave me was that he was Russian is of course his first language. He was from eastern Ukraine. And as you know, I mean, he spent a lot of time in Russia. The Russian audience was his biggest audience by far. He was tremendously popular as a comedian and an actor. And I think he thought that he would be able to find a way because he was from the East. That didn't turn out to be the case.
Yeah. All right, let's take some. I have many more questions, but I want to let others others ask. So Nancy asks a big question. What were all the factors that set Putin off? She asks.
What were all the factors that set Putin off?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, of course, this is one of the questions that we all debate endlessly. But I think that Putin has, and some around him have their own version of history that they have spent the last several years and the last several decades kind of honing and sharpening and so forth. And Putin has made clear, both in his writings and in his speeches, and now in the invasion, that he does not believe that the Ukrainian people exist as a separate people. In Russian, they call, he calls them little Russians. And he doesn't believe that Ukraine stands separate as a country that has a right to exist and has sovereignty. He claims that it's just a construct of the Soviet Union. And so what he's doing is, going back to basics and gathering in the Ukrainian lands to the mothership. I mean, not in those words, but I'm sort of paraphrasing. So I think that's incorrect. I think that that's part of the reason that he has been unsuccessful in Ukraine is that he's getting a lesson the hard way. That the Ukrainian people are actually a distinct people and that they feel very strongly about the lands that Russians are invading. But I think that he has sort of an alternative history that he has written about famously in a letter last summer, a very long letter last summer that he disseminated to many, including all of the Russian troops. And so he's intent on that. And as he made clear most famously on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, his sights are set further. I mean, he wants to reconstitute, whether it's the Russian Empire or the former Soviet Union, he wants to reconstitute that and bring all of the former republics back. And that, that is a real concern. And I think part of the reason that Ukraine needs to prevail, first and foremost, and we need to help Ukraine prevail, because if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, he's going to keep on going. Maybe not immediately, but over time, because that's what we've seen in his history. In 2008, There was the war in Georgia, where he took chunks of Georgia. In 2014, he took Crimea and started the war in the Donbass. And in 2022, he doubled down with this re-invasion of Ukraine. And I think that we'll see what happens now in the second phase of the war, with what looks like is going to be a big tank battle, a land war in the east of Ukraine. If he's successful, is he going to stop there, or is he going to keep on going? And my money is on the latter. So I think he's looking. So to answer the question shortly, rather than on and on and on, I would just say he's looking to establish his legacy. I think he's also looking to establish his popularity for the 2024 presidential elections in Russia. He did that quite successfully when he seized Crimea and then contested the presidential elections. That really increased his popularity and the number of votes. So I think those are two things, but there's probably a lot more going on in that mind.
So but you mentioned NATO earlier. You are not a believer in the idea that Ukraine's increasing sort of cooperation with NATO and promised eventual NATO membership were a factor, or are you?
I think it's kind of a red herring. I mean, sure, it's another factor out there, but I think that I don't think that's what we're seeing now. We're not seeing that in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine coming up as one of the issues. I'm just. I mean, actually, I should be. I stand corrected, because Zelensky seems to be putting on the table a neutral status for Ukraine. But actually, I think for Putin, it is about Ukraine. I don't think it is so much about NATO. Although, going back to the former question, certainly one of Putin's goals is to create disarray, not only within countries, foster the divisions within the United States or within France, Germany, meddle in elections and so forth, but within the alliance as well. And I think that when Putin looked around in 2021, as he was making his plans to invade Ukraine, I think he thought he saw a weak United States that was divided within itself. I think he saw Angela Merkel leaving the scene in Germany, and he saw France with elections coming up, and who knows what kind of a role he's playing in those elections. And then obviously lots of challenges in the UK. So I think he thought, I've got the West, they're not going to be strong and united. I've got this big, strong army, and the Ukrainians have nothing. And besides, they're going to welcome me as a liberator. And I think he made three huge miscalculations there.
There's a question from Irene about, and I'm going to read the question. I'm going to broaden it a little bit. It says, what are the best ways to fight disinformation inside Russia about the war in Ukraine? And then kind of the broader question is there, we are seeing something very disturbing in Russia, not just from the top, right, but from the kind of, there seems to be a certain amount of support for the war in Russia. And it's certainly, if you talk to sort of Ukrainian intellectuals, they will say, look, this is actually, deep in the sort of Russian tradition. There have not been, nearly enough, even among liberal intellectuals and dissidents, there's really not been enough support for the Ukrainian cause over the centuries, over the last decades. Navalny is a good example of someone who has.
It's just thinking.
Yeah, who has said, well, Crimea is going to remain Russia for the foreseeable future. Basically, Crimea is not a sandwich. I don't know what So Irene's question: what is the best way to fight disinformation, and what do you make of what's happening in Russia as someone with kind of a family background in Russia and the kind of good old Russia?
I lost my father a number of years ago, but I'm glad he can't see this because I think it would break his heart. I don't know what to make of it except that so first of all, I would say, and you probably know far more about this than I do, but it's my impression that Russia is a divided country where there is an elite that often lives in cities, is university educated, has access to internet, travels abroad, perhaps is educated and studies abroad. Their kids go abroad, they study abroad. They have access to all, or pre-war, they have access to all sorts of information, even if they choose not to believe it or to toe the party line, so to speak. And then there's people who live in the countryside who are not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. The good times that Russia saw with the oil boom over the last 20 years has passed those people by with no benefits, as far as I can tell. And they get their information from Channel One, the government, the main government sort of news channel, and other state-sponsored media. So they only get a certain point of view, and so understandably they believe it. They think that this is objective fact and that this is what they're going with. And of course it's presented to them that the brave Russian boys that are being brought back in body bags, that they are helping the Ukrainians and liberating them from fascists. And so, if that's what you're presented with, if that's what you're going to support this. So the other dangerous part of this is that over the last, 20 years since Putin has been in power, he has systematically dismantled any kind of opposition. So first he went after the oligarchs and they just became, his wallets, his money launderers, basically. They don't have influence. Then he went after the free press, he went after civil society, he went after the opposition, he went after enemies, even perceived enemies, even overseas, and assassinated them. I mean, ruthlessly cut anybody down who could provide any kind of an opposition. And today in Russia, there is no independent media as far as I know. Now, if you're enterprising and so forth through Telegram, which is a social media outlet, and through other ways, people are able to get information, but it's risky is the other thing. And so people need to be very careful, because if you say the word war, you can be convicted for up to 15 years in prison. I mean, that is a big penalty if you're just trying to live your life. It's really tough. And a couple of weeks ago, Putin made this astonishing speech where he talked about, those who are traitors, basically, and who are, taking money from foreigners and living under their influence, and how every Russian knows who these turncoats are. I mean, it was an impassioned and really disturbing speech in many ways, echoing, the language of fascism, almost calling on regular Russian citizens to, turn in or attack people that they suspect of, some sort of disloyal thoughts. And the result of all of this has been that since the war began, Putin's war of choice, hundreds of thousands of Russians have departed. And those are, the smartest people with means, the young people, the people who might actually be able to form an opposition. And they fled almost immediately, almost overnight. Is it up to 400,000 now?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible amount of people who fled, over the last several weeks, because they anticipated this speech and they were worried that they too would be locked up. So, going back to the question, how does one fight against this? I mean, I think we need to go back and study what we did during the Cold War, but use the technology, use that technology, but also use the technology of the 21st century So back in the day, we had the radios, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. We tried to do cultural diplomacy where we would do exchanges back and forth, where we would tell people about, American culture as a softer way to get into, perhaps some of the other topics, like what is a democracy and the importance of a free press and things like that. Today we have the internet. And so I think there's all sorts of ways that we can reach out. But the other thing I think we need to do is not only take a lesson from the Ukrainians, but to support the Ukrainian efforts, because they are really, first of all, this is a country with a lot of technical expertise. In fact, many Silicon Valley companies use Ukraine as their back room to do all sorts of functions. And they have been quite adept at sending messages, at hacking Russian sites, at doing all the sorts of things that maybe will enable some of the truth to get out to the people of Russia. But I think this is a hugely important question, and I wish I had a better answer for you.
That was a pretty good answer. Thank you. Babette asks what you think of President Biden's policy toward Russia, and I'll just and toward the situation. And I guess I would just say, what did you think of the intelligence kind of offensive that they ran before the war to kind of get all the information out? And what do you think of how the administration has conducted itself since the war began?
So on the intelligence side, there's really two parts of it. What is being released publicly, which I was shocked at first. And I just really applaud the US government, the UK government, and any other governments that are part of this. Because, in the US government, we always fear that releasing intelligence will compromise our sources and methods, that, people could actually die if that piece of information gets out and the Russians can figure out how we found it. So there's always a desire in that community to keep information close in order to protect what we call sources and methods. And so for me, now being retired, to see this deluge of information that, it really, I think, caught the Russians off guard. There's some evidence to show that they had wanted to invade much earlier, but they kind of had to regroup in the December time period. And I think that, when we say things like we're seeing evidence that they may be thinking about a CW or a BW attack, that denies Russia the ability to frame the narrative cold. And, they are still going to lie about this stuff, but we steal a march on them and we put them off their game. And I think it's incredible. And I think really, really important. And, I would also say, for all the people who said that the intel isn't true, it seems like it's been pretty accurate. And, the releases continue with, Defense Secretary, General Milley, with Jake Sullivan, the head of the NSC, and others talking about how, this is going to be a long-term effort on the part of the Russians, and we need to be ready for that kind of an effort. So that continues. The other part of the intel sharing is something that is perhaps less discussed, but we are sharing with the Ukrainians, and I think that's really important because anything that we can do to help them hone their abilities is good. And I'm glad that we're doing that, in spades. So there was another.
And then how they've been, how do you feel? How do you feel like the administration has done?
Yeah.
In the
I think that this administration is maneuvering on a very, very narrow path, very skillfully, because it's clear the administration understands the stakes, as you would expect with somebody who has as much experience in foreign policy as President Biden, where on the one hand, we don't want a democracy to lose to an autocracy. We don't want the methods of Putin to be successful. So, just in that sense, we want to support Ukraine. But I think in the broader sense, that this is an assault on the international order that has kept us, more secure, more free, more prosperous in the years since World War II. Again, we want to support Ukraine. But on the other hand, we don't want to broaden the war in really dangerous ways. And so that is a very narrow path that is a very risky path. And I think they are managing it very well. Between, the sanctions that they're laying on, the massive security assistance, humanitarian and economic assistance, I think they're doing a great job. And the other thing I would say is that things that were inconceivable 6 weeks ago are now commonplace, and we're looking for more. So if you think of sanctions, all of the sanctions that we've been talking about for years and nobody would ever do them, we're doing them now, and we're looking for more. Same thing with security assistance, where we would say, oh, the Ukrainians wouldn't know how to use this. They wouldn't, we're worried about the technology getting out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the red tape is just being cut, and supplies that usually take over a year to get to a country are taking weeks, sometimes even days. It is astonishing, and I think shows you the emphasis that is being put on this critical issue.
Yeah, great. I think we have time for one more question, and this has not come up, so it's a good question. It's about your testimony in front of Congress. I'm curious about your experience during the congressional testimony and what you drew from to steel yourself against the intensity of that situation. What did it feel like for you? What did it feel like for you in that room?
Well, it was a really difficult thing for me, because all my life, since I joined the Foreign Service, I was a nonpartisan bureaucrat, basically, and I followed the rules. And all of a sudden, I was thrust into a position where, it was a battle between Republicans, a Republican administration, and a Democratic Congress. And I felt I was kind of in the middle. I was being instructed by my employers, the State Department and the White House, that I should not testify. And yet, on the other hand, this was a constitutional proceeding. And so, I did debate with myself, but in the end, I decided that my duty was to the Constitution, not to any particular individual. But it was a frightening time, because I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know whether there would be retaliation. You'll recall that President Trump, in that infamous call, not to say perfect call, said she's going to go through some things. And, that rang in my ears. I didn't know what that meant. So it was, people often talk about how brave I was. I really wasn't. I didn't feel brave at all. I just felt I had to do my duty.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. Here's Marcia. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
I want to thank you both also. What an incredible lesson in recent history. What clarity you've shared with us. And Keith, thank you for steering this lesson. The book is Lessons from the Edge, but we have had an hour's worth of lessons right now, and I hope that everybody that's here tonight explores this book. We're at a moment of fragility. I think in democracies, even those that feel secure or used to feel secure. And one of the things that I took away from your book was how you described diplomacy as an optimistic profession. So, at a moment when we sort of need to have a little reality moment around what to feel good about, I think that's a lot of what one sees in this. So thank you. I want to let everybody know that we've recorded this and it will be posted tomorrow on the Center for Brooklyn History's YouTube channel. I hope that you will all explore the other incredible programs we have coming up. I mentioned Night of Ideas, which is incredible, May 21st, but mostly my deepest, sincerest, and heartfelt thanks to both of you. Good night to all.
Night.
You.